Entire civilizations didn't just disappear, they were erased. And in some cases, we still don't know why. So, what does it actually take to erase a civilization? Not just weaken it, not just damage it, erase it completely. Because history isn't just built by great empires. It's shaped by the moments that destroyed them. And some of those moments were so extreme, they almost erased us too. Number 10. Easter Island, the last tree. When Polynesian settlers first reached Easter Island, it was covered with palm forests, seabirds, and fertile soils. The island sat thousands of kilometers from any continent, isolated in the middle of the Pacific. That isolation offered protection, but it also imposed a limit. There was nowhere else to go. Whatever existed on the island was all the people had. For centuries, the Rapa Nui built one of the world's most remarkable monument traditions. The moai, massive stone ancestor figures, were carved from volcanic rock and moved to ceremonial platforms across the island. Their construction demanded labor, organization, timber, rope, and generations of cooperation. These statues were more than monuments. They reflected an entire belief system. At the same time, the resources supporting that society were slowly disappearing. Trees provided fuel, building materials, canoes, rope, and agricultural support. As the forests shrank, soil erosion increased. Large canoes became harder to build. Deep-sea fishing declined. Bird populations disappeared. Harvests became less reliable. Over time, the island's world grew smaller and more fragile. What makes Easter Island especially haunting is that no single disaster caused the decline. There was no great flood, volcanic eruption, or invading army. The collapse emerged gradually through decisions that seemed manageable in the moment, but became irreversible over generations. And if a few generations were enough to empty an island, what happens when an entire continent runs dry? Number 9. Green Sahara, when the desert arrived. Across the central Sahara, ancient artists left behind images of giraffes, elephants, crocodiles, hippos, fish, and long lines of cattle. These were not symbols from a distant imagination. They were records of a Sahara that looked completely different from the one we know today. During the African humid period, rainfall reached deep into North Africa. Lakes filled vast basins. Rivers crossed regions that are now almost entirely dry. People fished, herded animals, made pottery, and built communities around a landscape that seemed dependable. Then the climate shifted. The monsoon system gradually moved south. Rainfall became less reliable. Lakes shrank. Grasslands retreated. Rivers turned into dry channels of stone and dust. For the people living there, the disaster did not arrive all at once. It unfolded over generations, with each generation inheriting a little less water than the last. What disappeared was more than a green landscape. Ancient cattle traditions, seasonal migration routes, fishing knowledge, and entire ways of life were pushed into motion. Some communities moved south, others migrated toward the Mediterranean or the Nile Valley, carrying their knowledge into new worlds. The desert did not erase them completely. Their animals still remain on rock walls. Their lakes remain hidden beneath sand. But this disaster left its evidence on stone. The next one buried its evidence at the bottom of the sea, and what's down there might rewrite everything we know about flood myths. Number 8. Doggerland, the civilization beneath the sea. There was once a human world between Britain and Europe, and today almost everything we know about it comes from the floor of the North Sea. The land itself is gone. For decades, fishing boats have pulled up traces of that lost world. Flint tools, animal bones, antler implements, peat, and fragments of ancient forests. These remains belong to Doggerland, a vast stretch of lowland that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was not a narrow land bridge. It was a landscape of rivers, wetlands, forests, hunting grounds, and human communities. As the Ice Age ended, people lived there for generations. They knew its rivers, followed animal migrations, and built their lives around one of the richest environments in Mesolithic Europe. Then the sea began to rise. Slowly, the land was broken apart. Plains became marshes. Marshes became islands. Coastlines crept inland year after year. Hunting grounds vanished. Settlements were abandoned. Long before the final disaster arrived, Doggerland was already disappearing. Around 8,200 years ago, the Storegga Slide triggered a massive tsunami across the North Sea. A huge section of the Norwegian seabed collapsed, sending a wall of water toward the remaining lowlands. For those still living there, it may have been the final blow. What disappeared was more than land. Languages, Burial grounds, stories, trade routes, and generations of knowledge vanished beneath the water alongside it. The evidence still rises in fishing nets. Doggerland does not. But what if this flood is the reason every culture on Earth tells a story about one? The next disaster might be exactly where that story came from. Number 7. The Black Sea Deluge, the flood that became a legend. Thousands of years before the great flood stories of the ancient world were written down, a real sea may have broken through a narrow strait and swallowed an entire landscape of early farmers. The evidence lies beneath the Black Sea. Long before it took its modern shape, the Black Sea was lower and largely fresh water. Around its shores were fertile lands, fishing grounds, and stable settlements where early communities farmed, raised animals, and built their lives. Then, the shoreline changed. One theory suggests that Mediterranean water burst through the Bosphorus and poured into the basin below. If that happened, the transformation would have been dramatic. Water may have advanced across low-lying land, consuming fields, homes, paths, and burial grounds that had existed for generations. Much of that evidence remains hidden beneath deep water and sediment. If people lived along the former shoreline, their settlements may still lie buried on the bottom of the sea, beyond the reach of easy excavation. Researchers continue to debate how quickly the flooding occurred. Some argue for a sudden catastrophe. Others believe it unfolded more gradually. But the larger picture is difficult to dismiss. The shoreline moved, and habitable land disappeared beneath the water. Then we get to the forgotten superpower. Number 6. Indus Valley. One of the largest civilizations of the ancient world vanished so completely that, for thousands of years, history forgot it had ever existed. The ruins never disappeared. At Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists uncovered cities built with remarkable precision. Streets followed orderly grids. Bricks were standardized. Homes connected to drainage systems, wells, bathing areas, and public infrastructure point to a civilization that valued planning and urban life on a massive scale. Yet the people behind those cities left one of archaeology's greatest silences. The Indus script appears on seals, pottery, and tablets across a vast region, but no one has been able to read it. We do not know their rulers, their beliefs, or the stories they told about themselves. A civilization larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined left thousands of symbols, but no voice we can understand. Then the environment began to change. The monsoon weakened. Rivers shifted course. Water became less reliable. Farming grew more difficult. Trade networks weakened, and the great cities slowly emptied. Rather than collapsing in a single catastrophe, the civilization fragmented as people moved toward smaller settlements and more dependable sources of water. What disappeared was more than a collection of cities. It was an entire system for organizing millions of people. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley left behind no giant royal tombs, grand palace complexes, or triumphal inscriptions explaining how its society worked. But quiet collapses are one thing. The next empire didn't fade, it starved, in plain sight, while still trying to function. Number 5. Akkadian Empire. The empire that starved. More than 4,000 years ago, the world's first true empire discovered a problem that armies, administrators, and kings could not solve. The Akkadian Empire united cities across Mesopotamia under the rule of Sargon of Akkad, creating something larger than anything that had existed before. It was held together by governors, scribes, trade routes, grain supplies, and the movement of orders across vast distances. For a time, the system worked. The empire controlled fertile land, major rivers, and important trade networks throughout the Near East. Its officials managed provinces, its armies enforced authority, and its cities depended on harvests arriving year after year. Then the rain stopped. Around 4,200 years ago, a severe drought struck much of the region. Rain-fed farming began to fail. Harvests declined. Grain stores emptied, communities abandoned drying lands, and moved toward areas where water remained. What began as an environmental crisis quickly became a political one. The Akkadians had built one of the most advanced administrative systems of their age, but administration could not produce rainfall. Armies could not defeat drought. Records and orders meant little when the fields themselves were failing. That is what makes the collapse so important. The disaster exposed a weakness built into every large civilization. The larger the system becomes, the more it depends on resources continuing to flow. What disappeared was more than a ruling dynasty. One of humanity's earliest experiments with empire was pushed beyond its limits by a changing climate. The tablets survived. The ruined cities survived. The empire did not. But drought is slow. The next disaster wasn't. It came from a mountain that decided, in one afternoon, to end a civilization. Number 4. Thera, the volcano that ended a civilization. For centuries, the Minoans were among the most successful people in the Mediterranean. Based on Crete, they built palaces, produced remarkable art, and connected distant regions through trade. Their prosperity depended on the sea. Then, hundreds of kilometers away, a volcano began reshaping their future. The island of Thera, now known as Santorini, sat above a powerful volcanic system. During the Late Bronze Age, that system unleashed one of the largest eruptions in human history. Ash blasted into the atmosphere. Much of the island collapsed, and the eruption created the caldera that still exists today. The effects reached far beyond Thera itself. Nearby settlements were buried beneath ash, including the city of Akrotiri, preserved so remarkably that it is often compared to Pompeii. But the greatest threat may have come from the sea. The eruption triggered tsunamis that raced across the Aegean, striking coastlines, harbors, and trade centers throughout the region. For the Minoans, that was a serious problem. Their influence depended on ships, ports, and maritime trade. A civilization built around those networks could withstand many challenges, but damaging them all at once was another matter entirely. The eruption may not have destroyed the Minoans overnight, but it likely weakened the foundations of their power. In the years that followed, rival powers expanded while Minoan influence declined. But what happens when a disaster doesn't just end one civilization, but an entire interconnected world, all at once? You're about to find out. Number 3. Bronze Age collapse. The year the world burned. One of the most connected worlds in ancient history collapsed so completely that some societies lost writing for centuries. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as a vast network. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, Canaan, Ugarit, and Mesopotamia were linked through trade, diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the constant movement of goods across the sea. Kings exchanged letters, merchants transported metals across great distances, and scribes recorded transactions in thriving palace centers. Then, within a few generations, the system unraveled. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes failed, the Hittite Empire disappeared, Mycenaean palace culture collapsed, Ugarit, one of the great ports of the age, was destroyed. Even Egypt emerged weakened from the crisis. The exact cause remains debated because the collapse appears to have been many disasters at once. Drought reduced harvests, earthquakes damaged cities, trade disruptions cut off vital resources, population movements placed additional pressure on kingdoms already under strain. The tragedy was that the Bronze Age's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. Cities depended on imported grain. Bronze depended on metals from distant regions. Palaces relied on taxes, ships, scribes, and specialized labor. When those connections worked, they created wealth and stability. When they failed, entire kingdoms found themselves unable to function. What disappeared was enormous. Palace archives ended. Diplomatic networks collapsed. Trade knowledge, administrative systems, and political traditions were lost within a few generations. In parts of Greece, writing itself vanished for centuries. But even this isn't the strangest disaster on the list. The next one might not have come from this planet at all. Number 2. Younger Dryas. The morning the sky burned. A continent of giant animals disappeared at almost the same time one of North America's earliest known cultures faded from the archaeological record. That timing is what makes the Younger Dryas so intriguing. Around 12,800 years ago, the world was emerging from the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating, ecosystems were changing, and human groups, such as the Clovis people, lived alongside mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and other animals that no longer exist. Then the climate reversed. Temperatures across parts of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply, beginning a cold period that lasted more than 1,000 years. At roughly the same time, many of the great Ice Age animals disappeared, and the distinctive Clovis tool tradition faded from the record. The world before and after the Younger Dryas looked remarkably different. Exactly why remains debated. Some researchers point to massive meltwater releases that disrupted ocean circulation. Others support the idea that fragments of a comet or asteroid exploded over the ice sheet, contributing to fires, cooling, and environmental upheaval. The evidence is still contested, and no single explanation has been universally accepted. What is clear is the scale of the transformation. A continent once shaped by giant animals lost them. Hunting traditions, migration patterns, and ways of life built around that environment were forced to change. The survivors adapted, but they adapted to a different world. Then comes the creme de creme disaster. Number 1. Toba super-eruption, the day humanity nearly ended. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano on the island of Sumatra produced one of the largest eruptions of the last 2 million years. The eruption of Toba filled the atmosphere with vast amounts of ash and volcanic gases, covering landscapes in debris and leaving behind a caldera so large that it is now occupied by Lake Toba. But the eruption itself may not have been the greatest danger. What mattered was what entered the atmosphere. Ash and sulfur compounds may have reduced sunlight, cooled parts of the planet, shortened growing seasons, and disrupted ecosystems that early humans depended on. For small populations already living close to the edge, even modest environmental changes could have serious consequences. What happened next remains one of prehistory's most debated questions. Some genetic studies suggest that humanity passed through a severe population bottleneck around this period, shrinking to a surprisingly small number of breeding individuals. The connection to Toba is still debated, and some archaeological evidence suggests humans may have been more resilient than earlier theories proposed. Even so, the possibility remains difficult to dismiss. A single eruption may have pushed humanity closer to extinction than we realize. The true scale of that risk is difficult to measure because almost everything that mattered still lay in the future. There were no cities, kingdoms, monuments, or written records. Yet every civilization, language, invention, and story that would eventually exist depended on those surviving populations. Toba did not destroy a civilization. It threatened the species that would create them all. And if the bottleneck theory is even partly correct, human history may have come far closer to ending before it began than anyone once imagined.